Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I am Munib Hamid with the news of this hour. Let's begin with the headlines first. The Taliban have claimed 49 Afghan forces casualties during clashes in the northeastern Badakhshan province. The group's spokesman Zabihullah Mujahid says they also shot down a helicopter and seized ammunition. Meanwhile, the Kabul administration says the Taliban's recent attacks on the country's security forces reflect their jingoistic approach. Earlier, 3 explosions by an unknown group rocked the capital of Kabul, leaving 1 security personnel dead and 4 others wounded. Indian troops have martyred another Kashmiri youth in occupied Kashmir. The occupying forces targeted the civilian during a cordon and search operation in the Kiriri area of the Baramulla district. The occupied valley has been under New Delhi's crushing curfew and communications blackout for the past 384 days. The UAE says its peace deal with Israel will now allow direct advocacy for the Palestinian cause. In an article in an Israeli newspaper, the UAE's envoy to Washington, Yusuf al-Othaiba, said Abu Dhabi will push Israel for the establishment of a sovereign Palestinian state, now with stronger tools. The US has recorded 1,060 coronavirus deaths overnight, raising the toll to over 175,000 with 5.6 million infections, while Brazil has reported over 1,000 deaths and more than 30,000 COVID-19 cases in the past 24 hours, bringing the infections tally to 3.5 million. India has registered 945 deaths and the highest number of daily cases, with nearly 70,000 infections as the tally approaches 3 million. In Pakistan, 10 people died overnight, raising the death toll to 6,231 with over 292,000 infections. Globally, the pandemic has infected over 22.8 million people and claimed more than 797,000 lives. News in detail after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back now for the news in detail. We'll start from Afghanistan, where the Taliban have claimed 49 Afghan forces casualties during clashes in the northeastern Badakhshan province. The group's spokesman Zabihullah Mujahid said senior military commanders were also among those killed and wounded in the raids. Mujahid said they also shot down a helicopter and seized ammunition. Meanwhile, the Kabul administration said the Taliban's recent attacks on the country's security forces reflect their jingoistic approach. Presidential spokesman Siddiqui said the Taliban must be condemned by the international community for targeting Afghan military and people. Earlier, 3 explosions by an unknown group rocked the Kabul capital, leaving 1 security personnel dead and 4 others wounded. Security officials said 2 blasts occurred in the police district and the third hit a police vehicle. Indian troops have martyred another Kashmiri youth in occupied Kashmir. The occupying forces targeted the civilian during a cordon and search operation in the Kiriri area of the Baramulla district. The troops have sealed all entry and exit points of the area. Police say the operation is still underway in the vicinity. Last week, 5 Indian soldiers were killed in an attack during search operation in the same district of the valley. The occupied valley has been under New Delhi's crushing curfew and communications blackout for the past 384 days. Now, the UAE says its peace deal with Israel will now allow direct advocacy for the Palestinian cause. The UAE's envoy to Washington, Yusuf al-Othaiba, said Abu Dhabi will push Israel for the establishment of a sovereign Palestinian state, now with stronger tools. In an article in an Israeli newspaper, Al-Thaiba said the Israeli authorities have made encouraging statements regarding the peace deal, but their stance over the West-occupied bank annexation are a contradiction. It said the UAE awaits Israel's people's visit to the World Expo in Dubai next October. Al-Thaiba's article comes amid severe criticism on Abu Dhabi over signing the deal with Israel. Meanwhile, Israel says its tanks have targeted multiple locations on the Gaza Strip. The Defense Ministry says it struck Hamas military posts in retaliation for a rocket attack. No casualties have been reported so far. The tanks targeted positions of the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades in the raids. Tensions have been rising for over a week as Israel continues to bomb Gaza, accusing Hamas of launching incendiary balloon across the border. Israel has also closed the Karim Abu Salim goods crossing with the Gaza Strip. Now, the six-member Gulf Cooperation Council has welcomed a ceasefire announcement in Libya. Yesterday, Libya's UN recognized government and the rival parliament in eastern Libya both appealed for a halt to hostilities. The UAE state media said GCC has called on all parties to end hostilities and participate in the UN-mediated political dialogue to create a lasting solution in the region. Earlier, Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and the UN support mission also hailed the ceasefire calls by Libyan warring parties. Libya was thrust into turmoil when a NATO-backed uprising in 2011 toppled longtime ruler Muammar Gaddafi. The country has since split between rival East and West-based administrations, each backed by armed groups and foreign governments. Moving on now, the UN says it believes Syria peace talks in Geneva can lead to progress, but also cautions against hopes of a miracle. Speaking in Geneva, UN Special Envoy Geir Pedersen said this is the beginning of a long and cumbersome process. He said the talks in Geneva may lead to progress in other areas. Pedersen said he briefed the Security Council about the damage of the nearly 10-year-long war. Meanwhile, U.S. Special Envoy for Syria James Jeffrey said he will visit Switzerland and Turkey to discuss resolution of the Syrian conflict. Syria has been entangled in a civil war since early 2011 following Bashar al-Assad's brutal crackdown on pro-democracy protests. Meanwhile, the majority of UN Security Council has opposed U.S. to reimpose international sanctions on Iran. In separate letters, 13 countries on the 15-member council rejected the call, saying Washington's move is illegal. They questioned the legality of the move as the U.S. unilaterally quit the 2015 Iran nuclear deal in 2018. U.S. Envoy for Iran Brian Hook said Washington does not need anyone's permission to reimpose the arms embargo on Tehran. The Security Council has 30 days to adopt a resolution to extend the sanctions relief, otherwise the measures will automatically come into effect. Washington is set to veto any attempt to extend any such resolution. However, the 2015 treaty also directs the Security Council to consider the views of the member states. It means the body may not have to put up a draft text for voting, given overwhelming opposition over it. Now, the United States has imposed visa restrictions on 14 Iranian officials, accusing them of gross violations of human rights. In a statement, the U.S. State Department did not name 13 individuals, only designating Hojatullah Khudai-Sori as the 14th banned individual. The U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said as Iran's Evin prison chief, Sori oversaw torture and inhumane treatment of the prisoners. Pompeo referred to the officials as assassins, likely in reference to the killing of Tehran critic Kazim Rajavi in Switzerland in 1990. He said the officials posed as diplomats and silenced the opposition figure on the orders of the Iranian regime. The top U.S. diplomat said Washington will continue to pressure Tehran to treat its own people with dignity and respect. Moving on, Chinese President Xi Jinping says the China-Pakistan economic corridor holds great importance in forging closer ties with Islamabad. He made these remarks in a letter to Pakistan's President Arif Alvi. Xi said Pakistan and China are all-weather strategic partners who share a special friendship. He said China will continue to work with Pakistan for promotion of peace and development in the region. He said political parties from both sides often carry out friendly consultations and constantly build political consensus. He also hailed Alvi's congratulatory message to the second conference of the CPEC political parties' joint consultation mechanism. The platform was established in 2019 between China's Communist Party and major parties of Pakistan. Facebook says it has to do better to curb hate speech in India as it battles allegations of ignoring hate speech by the leaders of governing right-wing Bharatiya Janata Party. In a statement, Facebook's India chief said the company will review and remove content that violates its community standards. Last week, a US media report said Anki Das, a top company executive in India, refused to remove hateful posts by a legislator from the ruling BJP and 3 other Hindu nationalist individuals and groups to avoid damaging the company's business interests in the country. BJP lawmaker from Telangana, T. Raja Singh, called for the mainly Muslim Rohingya refugees in India to be shot. The report said Das told staff to ignore hate speech by the BJP even after the posts were flagged by the Facebook staff. In Pakistan, COVID-19 active cases have dropped to a record low, with just over 10,000 infected patients remaining in the country. The Health Ministry has reported a recovery rate of over 93% across the country. It said 10 people lost their lives overnight, bringing the total to 6,231. The ministry said nearly 600 people tested positive in the past 24 hours, taking the tally to over 292,000. Meanwhile, a World Health Organization-backed study says 11% of Pakistanis have developed protective immunity against coronavirus. The study suggests that areas with lower immunity rates may be at higher risk for future outbreaks. Meanwhile, the US has recorded 1,060 coronavirus deaths overnight, raising the toll to over 175,000 with 5.6 million infections. While Brazil also reported over 1,000 deaths and more than 30,000 COVID-19 cases in the past 24 hours, bringing the infections tally to 3.5 million. India has registered 945 deaths and the highest number of daily cases with nearly 70,000 infections as the tally approaches 3 million. Globally, the pandemic has infected over 22.9 million people and claimed nearly 800,000 lives. More details in this report.
Despite multiple countries reporting downwards trend in deaths and cases, the coronavirus pandemic is far from over around the globe. The US has closed lanes at select ports of entry at the border with Mexico and will conduct more secondary checks to curb the spread of the coronavirus. In Mexico, the famous floating gardens of Xochimilco have reopened to visitors after a 5-month lockdown. Meanwhile, the World Health Organization chief says the pandemic will last less than 2 years.
We hope to finish this pandemic before less than 2 years, especially if we can pull our efforts together and with national unity, global solidarity. That's really key, with utilizing the available tools to the maximum and hoping that we can have additional tools like vaccine.
Australia's second most populous state of Victoria has reported 13 new deaths as the cases remain below 200 for the second day straight. In Europe, Germany has issued travel warnings for Brussels and French Guiana following an infection spike in the regions. Meanwhile, in Italy, citizens have headed to the beaches to cool off the heat woes, but fears remain for a resurgence of the virus. Mainland China has reported 22 new imported cases with no domestic transmissions, while in South Korea, 332 cases were reported in the past 24 hours as the country expanded stricter social distancing measures nationwide.
More news coming up after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back now. The US says it has suspended cooperation with Mali's military following the ouster of President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta by the army. Speaking in Senegal's capital, Dakar, US envoy to Sahel region Jean-Peter Pham said the military ties will remain suspended until the political situation in the country is clarified. He said the decision to formally designate the action a coup had to go through a legal review. The US regularly provides training to soldiers in Mali, including several of those who led the coup. Earlier, Mali's military released 2 senior government officials detained during the coup against Keïta. The release came as junta leaders held discussions about creating a transitional authority. The UN Refugee Agency has called for renewed solutions for displaced and stateless Rohingya communities inside and outside Myanmar. The Refugee Agency says the answer to the plight of the Rohingya lies in Myanmar and implementation of Advisory Commission's recommendations. It said nearly 900,000 people took refuge in Bangladesh 3 years after the crisis there peaked. UNHCR spokesman Andrej Mahecic said up to three-quarters of the Rohingya people are living outside of Myanmar. It said Rohingya people's safe return will require resuming dialogue between Myanmar authorities and refugees. The Rohingya are described by the UN as the world's most persecuted people who face fears of attacks since dozens were killed in communal violence in 2012. South Korea and China have held the highest level of one-on-one bilateral dialogue since the COVID-19 outbreak began. Seoul's National Security Director Soo Hoon and Beijing's Communist Party's political bureau official Yang Jai-shi held the talks in the Korean city of Busan. The presidential Blue House said the Soo and Yang discussed Chinese President Xi Jinping's delayed visit, coronavirus pandemic and the Korean peninsula. Xi had agreed to visit South Korea last December before the pandemic struck. Seoul says it expects Beijing to play a constructive role to revive the peace process in the Korean peninsula during the ongoing dialogue. Belarus's opposition politician Svetlana says she will not run for the presidency if the country holds new elections. Tsikhanouskaya has held some of the biggest protests against Lukashenko since he came into power with the fall of the Soviet Union. In an interview, Tsikhanouskaya said the release of political prisoners is one of the major demands of the protesters. She said new, fair and transparent elections can restore justice in the country. Earlier this week, Tsikhanouskaya said she was ready to lead Belarus and called for fair presidential elections to be held. Mass protests broke out against Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, accusing him of rigging the election. Lukashenko has denied the allegations. The acutely ill Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny has arrived in Germany for treatment. On Thursday, Navalny fell into a coma after drinking what his supporters suspect was a poisoned tea. Navalny's aides believe he was poisoned, though Russian doctors said tests showed no trace of any poison. The doctor said Navalny appeared to have a metabolic disorder and suffered a sharp drop in blood sugar levels. Navalny will be treated at the Charité Hospital in Berlin. In the U.S., the raging California fires have killed at least 6 people and injured 43 civilians and firefighters. Governor Gavin Newsom has urged vulnerable communities to evacuate as soon as possible. Newsom said 2 of the wildfires are now the 7th and 10th largest in the state's history. He said more than 12,000 firefighters are battling the blazes. The governor has appealed Australia and Canada for assistance to extinguish fires, while relief packages are coming in from other U.S. states as well. Emergency officials said the fires have doubled in size in the past 24 hours, burning 771,000 acres of land. And now let's have a look at the weather updates. Well, that's all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Take care.